Good evening and welcome. My name is Kathleen Quinn, and on behalf of the faculty and staff of the Department of History and Geography, I would like to thank all of you who have ventured out tonight on this rather cold evening to attend the first of what we hope will become a regular series of departmental lectures focused on the intersection of history, geography, Black studies, and women and gender studies. Tonight's lecture, An Army of Liberation, is made possible through the generous support of Dr. Burke Miller, Chair of the Department of History and Geography, and through collaboration with the College of Arts and Sciences, the NKU Alumni Office, the NKU Bookstore, NKU Marketing and Communications, Phi Alpha Theta History Honor Society, and the University of North Carolina Press. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight and to welcome him home, so to speak. Dr. Christopher Teeters is a native of the tri-state area and an alum of NKU. He earned his BA in history from NKU in 2003, and while at NKU, he was an active member of Phi Alpha Theta, our History Honor Society, and he published his first article in our department's journal, Perspectives in History. While attending NKU and even after his graduation, Dr. Teeters worked closely with Emeritus and former Regents Professor Dr. James Ramage on several Civil War-themed projects, including a co-authored article on public reactions to Grant's Vicksburg campaign in Kentucky and Cincinnati, which was published in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Teeters' interest in Civil War history and scholarship led him to pursue graduate work at the University of Alabama, where he completed his PhD in history in 2012. Dr. Teeters' dissertation, entitled Freeing the Slaves, An Examination of Emancipation Military Policy and the Attitudes of Union Officers in the Western Theater During the Civil War, is the basis for the book which we are celebrating here tonight, Practical Liberators, Union Officers in the Western Theater During the Civil War. In addition to his work on emancipation policy, Dr. Teeters has published articles and given academic presentations on other aspects of Civil War history, including an examination of how social class affected the motives of Alabama's Confederate soldiers and a study of how Alabamans chose to commemorate the centennial of the Civil War. Since earning his PhD, Dr. Teeters has held lecturer positions here at NKU and at Texas A&M University and Stephen F. Austin State University in Texas. He currently serves on the faculty of Western Governors University. We encourage you to stay after the talk for a short Q&A session, after which there will be refreshments and a book signing in the lobby outside. But for now, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Teeters, and his lecture, An Army of Liberation.
Well, it's great to be back and to see so many friendly faces. Thank you very much, Professor Kathleen Quinn, for that generous introduction. I have so many happy memories at Northern Kentucky University. I was in the audience so many times in this very room. So it's such a pleasure to be back here. So I want to thank the department and all the other sponsors and the people that made it possible for me to be here and talk about the Civil War a little bit tonight. My interest in the American Civil War dates back to a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1993 when my father suggested that the family go see the movie Gettysburg. I'm not sure he knew it was about 5 hours long when he suggested going to see it, but it was definitely a transformational moment in my life because from the time that I saw that movie, I was hooked. From Brigadier General John Buford's gallant stand on the first day of the battle to Major General George Pickett's famous charge on the last day. It all interested me. But like so many other fans of the movie, I was particularly captivated with one character, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of Maine. It was later General Chamberlain. He was colonel at Gettysburg. For me, Chamberlain, who in the movie was portrayed by Jeff Daniels, embodied the heroism of Civil War soldiers. For someone in the 6th and 7th grade, this all made sense at that time. And then later on, he went on to play in Dumb and Dumber and things like that, and it didn't seem so exciting. But at that moment, Jeff Chamberlain embodied, the Jeff Daniels character embodied the heroism of Civil War soldiers. I was deeply moved by the famous scene, of course, where Chamberlain leads his 20th Maine in a desperate bayonet charge to save the Union Army's flank on Little Round Top. The fact that Chamberlain had been a college professor before the war added to my fascination, because that's what I wanted to be, even at that age. After seeing the movie several times, I also came to admire Chamberlain's idealistic views about the Union war effort. There was one scene specifically that I remember watching time and time again. It depicted Chamberlain giving a speech about the meaning of the Union struggle to a group of soldiers from the 2nd Maine who wanted out of the service. And so Chamberlain here, before one of the greatest battles of the Civil War, was trying to convince these soldiers of what the Union was fighting for, what was at stake in Pennsylvania in 1863. During the speech, Chamberlain waxed eloquent about the Union Army's special purpose to free the slaves. Quote, "This is a different kind of army. If you look back through history, you will see men fighting for pay, for women, for some other kind of loot. But we are here for something new. This has not happened much in the history of the world. We are an army out to set other men free." The key line that resonated with me. So years later, when I decided to look at emancipation, and particularly the Western theater, I thought about Chamberlain. I thought, well, maybe these officers thought like Chamberlain did. In some ways, I think in my kind of overly optimistic, because I knew by that point that a lot of them probably didn't, because I had read a lot of the literature. But in my overly optimistic ideas about the Civil War, I hope that more of them did, at least, than I thought. In some ways, I hope that a majority did, that they believed in emancipation as a moral prerogative, that they wanted to free the slaves. I found something very different when I went into the thousands of letters that I looked through in the collections for this study. I found that that many of them did not think like Chamberlain, or at least the character Chamberlain. Let me make that distinction. The real Chamberlain's a little more complicated than that character, of course. But many of them did not think like that at all. What I actually found was that pragmatism, far more than morality, motivated Western officers to support emancipation. They, in fact, viewed it primarily as a necessary military measure that would help the Union, hurt the Confederacy, and end the war. There were those few officers who embraced emancipation for more moral reasons, but they were greatly outnumbered by their practical comrades. Emancipation, in fact, was very controversial among Western theater officers. A significant number of officers opposed it when the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued in September 1862. That opposition will only intensify when the final proclamation was issued in January 1863. Emancipation certainly produced intense divisions in the Army. There were those officers who did come around to support it later, and it was primarily pragmatic considerations that drove them to do that too. So the officers that initially responded with support, pragmatism, practical, and then even the ones who opposed it at first and then came around later, it was practical considerations for them in large part. This is not the whole Union Army, but it's a good cross-section for sure. And also, from beginning to end, they expressed the deep racial prejudices of their era Most of the officers, in fact, that I looked at were from the Midwest. And they expressed intense racism. Even at the end of the war, when some of them were saying emancipation is a good thing, I could find very little evidence in all the letters that I looked at that they ever supported racial equality or African American voting rights. There's very little evidence of that. In fact, when they talk about, which is hard to find in itself sometimes because it's at the end of the war, they express opposition to African American voting rights. And let me just give you a little background about the theater I examined, and then I'll quickly get into the officers, and we'll look at some of their quotes and some of their words. The Western theater was vast. This is one of the reasons I chose the West to analyze. The Western theater consisted of the region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, roughly. It included the states of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The Western theater was quite different than the Eastern theater, which was dominated by the state of Virginia. And so when I wanted to look at emancipation, I knew that a majority of the South's slaves were in the Western theater. So if you're going to look at the process on the ground, which we're talking more about attitudes tonight, but the larger work looks at the process on the ground, you would want to look in the West. And the West had been understudied. It had not been looked at as much as Virginia. So understanding how slavery fell apart in Mississippi and fell apart in Georgia had not really been looked at significantly. There had been there's some good literature on it, but I wanted to look at both attitudes and policy. Let me give you an idea. When the Union armies set out at the beginning of the war, the primary purpose was not to liberate the South slaves. It was not an army of emancipation at first. Some officers, in fact, barred slaves altogether from their lines. Henry Halleck in his General Orders No. 3. This is during the war's first 15 months, as we get closer and closer to the summer of 1862. In the war's first year, there's a lot of confusion on the ground about how to handle fugitive slaves who had run to the Union Army. In many ways, these brave men and women who had run to the Union Army were forcing Union officers to confront an issue that they didn't want to confront, that they were hoping in some ways to avoid. Henry Halleck, barring all slaves from Union lines. You look at Don Carlos Buell in the Western theater. And so you get a policy, though, because during the first years of the war, Washington was given a little direction, but not a whole lot. You get a policy that was pretty uneven and inconsistent. And there certainly was differences in policy. There certainly, in the vast theater, like the Western theater, with different armies, different commanders did different things. And there was conflict on the ground over whether to allow fugitive slaves in Union lines or not. But what I found was that started to even out, the policy did, once the Second Confiscation Act was passed. And the Second Confiscation Act was passed in July of 1862. And the Second Confiscation Act allowed the Union Army to confiscate those slaves who belonged to rebels, those people who had rebel sympathies. Now, this sometimes was difficult to determine on the ground, but that's what the Second Confiscation Act did. They passed an earlier First Confiscation Act, which was enshrined the idea of contraband of war, Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe. But that only allowed the Union Army to confiscate slaves who had been actively employed by the Confederacy. So there's two different confiscation acts that were passed. What I found is when you get to July of 62 with the second one, then the Union Army in the West starts to at least confiscate slaves. Things become more uniform. Not in some places. Missouri and Kentucky, things do not in the border South. But in a lot of places, if you look at Grant's army and even Butler's army in Louisiana, you start to see a more vigorous pro-emancipationist policies. So let's look at some of these attitudes. So that's what's happening with the policy. That's what's happening on the ground. That's where we're at. We're in Alabama, we're in Mississippi, well, at this point in 1862, we're a lot in Tennessee, we're in northern Mississippi. We're not quite in the deep south yet, but this is the theater we're looking at, okay? And so let's look at some of these attitudes. Let's hear the officers themselves. One of the major reasons for the lagging support that I found when I read officers' letters, one of the major reasons for that lagging support for emancipation was the fact that many did not explicitly enlist to free the slaves. In fact, as he was organizing the 11th Illinois in Springfield, W.H.L. Wallace commented, quote, "The feeling here is tremendous and almost unanimous in sustaining the government." Another Illinoisan, Captain David Sparks of the 3rd Illinois Cavalry, loved his family so much, he wrote that he would risk his life so that they may have a free government. This again and again, I'm only giving you a couple examples, but again and again you get this sentiment. This idea of saving the Union was so important to these men who enlisted, these men who some would be officers from the outset, some will be promoted to officers, but this idea of saving the Union was so important. In fact, many of them don't even mention emancipation. When I did find a great example, the Chicago Historical Society, where emancipation was mentioned, it was actually opposed. And it came from George Avery. George Avery, who served as an officer in the 3rd Missouri Cavalry, wrote home, is it not reasonable to suppose that if we make one division without resenting it at the peril of our lives, we would soon be called upon to sanction another upon the same terms? I will fight till I die before I see this once glorious Union rent in twain. But at the same time that he said this, Avery deplored any move toward emancipation. He did not want African Americans in the North or anywhere close to him, he wrote. Avery, quote, would not sleep one night in the tented field to free every slave in America. Indeed, he went as far as to claim when President Lincoln declares the slaves emancipated, I will declare myself no longer an American citizen. So that was a pretty strong form of opposition. They all didn't express that, but you'll see as for some of these letters that a lot of them definitely opposed it very strongly. Given this motivation and given why they enlisted, it is not surprising that officers expressed a variety of opinions when the Union government started to move in a more emancipationist direction. Some officers wholeheartedly supported the Second Confiscation Act. Largely, it was for its practical benefits. At the head of the 3rd Ohio, Colonel John Beatty lamented recent military setbacks, particularly the failure of the Union Army to capture Richmond, but he trusted the Confiscation Act would, quote, have good effect. This was because, quote, slavery is the enemy's weak point, the key to his position. If we can tear down this institution, the rebels will lose all interest in the Confederacy. Some officers, it's important to note, not all officers were just practical. This is the majority. You've got a lot of different opinions here as well. Some officers were going much further in the summer of 1862. Captain William Moore of the 10th Wisconsin was utterly appalled to see female slaves working in the fields. This was probably one of the first times he had seen slavery. This is the first time he recorded it in his diary. And William Moore wrote in his diary, whoever was responsible deserves not the name of man. He should have inhabited some lonely isle where the female form should never greet his sight, and where pondering upon this curious freak of nature, he might hate himself to death. So this is his first reaction. So there's some who are seeing slavery the first time and responding and saying, I don't like this. Particularly seeing women work in the fields was appalling to more. Others saw other things that were appalling to them. Lieutenant George Landrum in the 2nd Ohio was also horrified over what he saw of slavery around the same time. Quote, there is more barbarism in one little place like this in the South than there is in the entire state of Ohio. Uncle Tom's Cabin should be enlarged upon. But more often during this period, more often than these kinds of letters, what I found was they were embracing emancipation for more practical reasons. For example, by the end of May 1862, Captain Emerson Updike of the 41st Ohio was ready to make all needed sacrifices to destroy slavery. Slavery must go out if the South was ever to be conquered, he concluded. There were some officers who embraced these practical attitudes towards emancipation and specifically mentioned events from the war. They were following events from the war. One event from the war that had an influence on these officers was when Robert E. Lee repulsed the Union Army of the Potomac from the gates of Richmond. And shortly after learning about these battles around Richmond, a doctor in the 72nd Ohio, William Caldwell, seethed. The very works against which our brave troops dashed themselves and from which they were repulsed so disastrously were built by slaves. During a recent campaign against Corinth, Caldwell noted slaves had constructed 50 miles of breastworks. To Caldwell, the conclusion was obvious. Quote, let us confiscate, emancipate anything to weaken the power of the traitorous villains whose hands are already reeking with the best blood of the land. You can see they're quite clear on how they think about this. But from the available evidence, it appears that nearly as many officers were still opposed to taking the war in an emancipationist direction. And racial considerations definitely ranked among one of the primary reasons for that opposition. Charles Wills, an adjutant in the 7th Illinois Cavalry, saw slaves working in the fields. Remember, William Moore saw slaves working in the fields, but look at these different reactions. He thanked God that none of them were in Illinois. And then he said, quote, candidly, I'd rather see them and a whole crop of grindstones dumped into the Gulf than have so many of them in our state as there are even here. He would rather have the South hold on to its slaves than have the North, quote, degraded by them. The racial concerns are moving Wills. Similarly, William McDowell of the 64th Ohio was certain that if freed, many slaves would go north, and he wanted no part of it. He worried that African Americans would not be able to find jobs and then would have to be supported at the expense of the hard-working class of white people. But there were even broader considerations in play with McDowell's opposition to emancipation. The lieutenant feared that emancipation would alienate the border states and Southern Unionists, which would only make it more difficult to win the war. McDowell summed up his feelings on the issue as follows. I will not be a target for a black prize, McDowell wrote. In November 1862, McDowell resigned his commission It's unclear whether that resignation was due to emancipation, but given the date, it's pretty likely because he's intensely against it. Such officers even despise the mention of abolitionism. An assistant surgeon in the 41st Ohio overheard a fellow surgeon claim that the rebellion grew out of the rabid abolitionism of such men as Giddings and Wade, and they all ought to be hung. The surgeon believed that slavery was the just and right condition, and the Union as it was should be preserved. Major Frederick Boardman of the 4th Wisconsin would never even attend religious services because the regimental chaplain was too abolitionist. When Boardman appealed to a politician back home, this is when the chaplain was sent home, when the man resigned, Boardman appealed to a Democratic politician back home to try to have a chaplain sent with as little abolition about him as can be helped. A Democratic lieutenant in the 14th Michigan wanted, quote, the abolition priesthood of the northern states to have to suffer the hardships of military service. No set of men have more to account for than they, he contended. They should be the mule drivers for this army. And the spring and summer of 1862 only saw them more polarized over this question. Policy on the ground was decisively turning emancipationists, even if their attitudes weren't. With thousands of slaves finding refuge in Union lines, many officers were still not committed to such a purpose. And here are some examples after the proclamation. So this is after the government has clearly decided that during, or at least after the preliminary proclamation, some of them are after the proclamation in January, the final, this is after the government has clearly decided to take an emancipationist course. Now, Captain Oscar Jackson, he was pro-emancipation. Oscar Jackson was in the 63rd Ohio. He was an ardent Republican who had campaigned for Lincoln vigorously in 1860. But he had said he had been no abolitionist. Yet, as a result of his wartime service, he came to sympathize with African Americans. He had been shot in the face at the Battle of Corinth, and a black servant that he had nursed him back to health. In January 1863, shortly before Jackson returned to his Ohio unit, he gave a speech in Hocking County, Ohio. He got death threats the day he gave that speech because there were so many Democrats. Democrats weren't for emancipation, a lot of them during this time. And in that area, he got all these death threats. But he said, I'm not going to stay away from speaking. So he went and he gave a speech with a revolver on the stand. He declared himself an unconditional abolitionist. No one did anything. Well, few officers did embrace emancipation under such dramatic circumstances. Many had come around to this position. And again, it was this pragmatism. Many, though, to distinguish them from Jackson, they didn't like the term abolitionist. An assistant surgeon with the 13th Iowa, Seneca Thrall, reported in November 1862 that, quote, a very large majority of this portion of the Army endorse the President's proclamation on emancipation. They regard it as a military expedient and necessity to crush out the rebellion. They supported it not because they favored the abolition of slavery or the freedom of the slave, but because the rebels use them as essential aids to their cause and because it is their vulnerable point. Channing Richards of the 22nd Ohio favored the proclamation because it struck at the foundation of the rebellion. I never take up arms to free the slaves, Richards wrote, but they have to be freed because they assist the Confederates and they are the cause of their being in rebellion, and when taken away, they can be used to assist us. And it continues. Colonel Robert Lantham actually summed up his support for the proclamation very briefly. I believe it to be the way to put down the rebellion and end the war, and that is what I'm for. And for many of them, that was pretty much it. Although not as quickly as many junior-level officers, some top-level commanders in the West also saw emancipation's importance in achieving victory. The man who would become the leader of Union forces by the end of the war, in August 1863, Grant admitted that he had never been an abolitionist or anti-slavery. But now he believed slavery needed to go if there was ever going to be a lasting peace between the North and South. He did not want to see the war end until this question was forever settled. And I want to give you a flavor for, on the other side, the kind of opposition that happened during the same time that these pragmatic officers or practical liberators were expressing support for emancipation. Far more troubling for the Union cause and the government, at least at the time, was the large group of officers who vigorously opposed emancipation. A captain in the 35th Iowa, George Burmeister, pointed out that the proclamation was, quote, the topic of universal discussion and vehemently opposed by anti-administration Democrats. Burmeister also noted that his own lieutenants in Company C of that Iowa regiment were not in favor of emancipation and worked to extend the spirit of dissatisfaction that is brooding over our troops. Some in John Robert Dow's 31st Ohio were perhaps even more contentious. Quote, we have officers in our regiment, Dow maintained, that care no more for their country than they do for a dog, because they're so much against emancipation. Dow told how Captain Putnam of his regiment had resigned over the proclamation. In March 1863, Captain John McDermott of the 91st New York noted that though few were accepted, there were a great many resignations in the army in Louisiana. The amount of discontent there was, quote, astonishing, as the proclamation was, quote, alarmingly unpopular. McDermott declared, it is my honest conviction that if the door was open for resignation, that 7/10 of the line officers here would go home within a muster. This I believe not on slight evidence either. General Grant received several resignations. They're in Grant's papers, and recommended in every case that the officer be dismissed from the Army with a dishonorable discharge. Not surprisingly, Kentuckians, Kentucky being a slave state, and it did not secede from the Union, a border state, Kentuckians were especially disgusted with the proclamation. The brother of a Confederate colonel, Lieutenant W.S. Johnson of the 17th Kentucky, resigned over the issue, only to be sent to prison. Once released, he resigned again. And this time they decided just to dismiss him from the service. Another Kentucky officer, Major Henry Colfax, sent in his resignation 3 times until he was finally arrested and escorted out of Union lines with a dishonorable discharge. But many stopped short of resignations. Not all officers that opposed emancipation resigned. Other officers simply expressed intense opposition to emancipation. One of these was William Ferry of the 14th Michigan, who served nearly the entire war. At the end of his service, he was given a brevet lieutenant colonelcy for distinguished service for his bravery in combat. Ferry passionately denounced emancipation and abolitionists. quote, "Oh, infamous, it seems from here to see the North still lending ear and heart and votes to a set of contemptible bigots who caused the murder of thousands of white men, made widows and orphans of thousands upon thousands to give what they call freedom to a race of beings who only can be governed by the system adopted by the Saxon race for the good of all." Ferry lamented at the end of October 1862. "No one here in the Army cares two straws for black people. Nothing cures men of abolitionism like being in the Army." According to Ferry, freedom was a condition that black people were not capable of enjoying, a plain truth to him that the Founding Fathers had understood. For some other officers, racial considerations appeared to be dominant. On Christmas 1862, so this is within about a week of the final Emancipation Proclamation. On Christmas 1862, Captain Oliver Spaulding of the 23rd Michigan recorded in his diary, "On the whole, I think a system of servitude or serfdom better for both whites and blacks than immediate emancipation." This was because he believed most black people were lazy and shiftless and would become worthless vagabonds if freed. So you get an idea of the kind of racist attitudes in the Union Army and how violently they opposed emancipation. Now, many of these officers, we don't have time to get into all of them tonight, but many of these officers some of them did change their minds. But I bet you can guess what changed their minds. It was practical considerations. Some of these officers denounced emancipation over and over and over, and then finally they supported it because they thought, well, it might help win the war, and it's going to become a reality anyway. You know, I don't know, some of these officers, when you read about 50 of their letters and you come away, you don't know I don't believe some of them supported that much. They said finally the events had pretty much pushed them in that direction. And let me talk for a couple minutes at the end here about African American soldiers. So emancipation, practical considerations dominate the support of emancipation, intense opposition. Eventually, later in the war, you do have a lot of support for emancipation for practical reasons. African American troops, the use of African American troops was even a more contentious issue. If emancipation was divisive, this one was even more divisive. And one of the reasons that I found it was more divisive is they were very concerned, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were very concerned that if African Americans were allowed to serve in the Army, then they would eventually be allowed to be citizens and they were allowed to vote. And so the racial considerations were definitely played a prominent role here as well. Some officers, in fact, who favored emancipation, opposed black enlistment. William White of the 6th Michigan was anti-slavery, but he was doubtful about Major General Benjamin Butler's soldiers in Louisiana. Assistant Surgeon Seneca Thrall of the 13th Iowa thought that emancipation was a practical necessity that anybody could see, but he thought that organizing black regiments was worse than ridiculous nonsense. And he believed they wouldn't fight. Captain Channing Richards of the 22nd Ohio confessed in March 1863 that he had no faith in black troops, doubting that slaves governed for so long by the lash could, quote, have the manhood left to make good soldiers. He believed they would only make trouble in the Army, could be used in other ways, and would cause no end of difficulties with the enemy. And he would certainly object to sitting at a court-martial table with a dozen black captains. Michigan Captain Harrison Sewell was even more direct. He told his wife in April 1863 that he could never tip his cap in respect for any black captain, and in fact would not recognize black soldiers. The The ones already in service in Louisiana were, quote, a failure because they were not willing to run any risk in this rebellion. Sewall's wife, you can actually see the back and forth between the two. Sewall's wife disagreed. She suggested that black men were effective soldiers. Well, this only got Sewall angrier. He then retorted in the next letter, quote, I wish as fast as they organized them, they might be sent to a good old New England, and about 40,000 of them stationed a while in Michigan. And that's where Sewall was from. So you can even see the tension. You don't always get the home front, the letters from the home front, because they didn't survive. But some of them, you're lucky enough to find those perspectives as well. But despite racial prejudices, some officers still supported black soldiers because they would help win the war. Captain John Ferry of the 54th Indiana asked, quote, if they, black troops, can render assistance, should they be denied the privilege? His answer was emphatically no, as he was ready to congratulate any black regiment that defeated the Confederates. Lieutenant Henry Potter of the 4th Michigan Cavalry informed his sister that black men made good fighting soldiers to the benefit of the Union. Then he boldly added, show me a man who is down on black troops, and I will show you a coward. Yes, a moral coward, and I believe God hates a coward. And then I'll end and conclude with one story, Jacob Bruner. Jacob Bruner, whose letters are in the Ohio Historical Society today, was not eager to emancipate African Americans or command African American troops. He, in fact, believed that black people deserved to be slaves, and that if freed, they should either be colonized outside the country or in South Carolina. Bruner supported the new policy, though, of arming African American troops. He considered it, quote, a master stroke. But even this was a practical consideration. Bruner stood the chance if he volunteered to be in an African American regiment, he would be promoted. And so his initial support, I think, can be definitely linked to practical considerations. But you do notice in his letters, as you read more and more, as he actually commands those African American troops, disciplines them, trains them, he does come to respect them. You do see that come out in the letters. In fact, he would die in June 1863, leading black soldiers at the Battle of Milliken's Bend in terrible combat. So while many of those Western Union soldiers did not match the Colonel Joshua Chamberlain that I remember when I was young, they certainly didn't. They were very different from that character played by Jeff Daniels. And at times it disappointed me reading their letters. Again and again I ran across this sentiment. And I kind of wanted more of them to view it as a moral prerogative. Some did, but most didn't. But in the end, we cannot make history into what we desire, nor should we ever try. Thank you.